Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome back. Welcome to the third and final day of the trainings. And today we're going to go through lesson 7 on reporting greenhouse gas emissions. And this will be the last lesson in which we cover the requirements in the corporate standard. Lesson 8 will provide a review of all of the material we have covered so far. And then we'll do an inventory exercise, which will entail constructing an inventory for a hypothetical company, and that will help consolidate all of the material we covered throughout the course. And then finally, Yelena will close the trainings with some information reminders on administrative issues. Is that right, Yelena, or is there need to do that?
Yes, that's right. I can do that.
Okay, thank you. So without further ado then, let's jump into the lesson on reviewing. Excuse me, let's jump into the lesson on reporting greenhouse gas emissions inventories. Okay. And in this lesson, we'll cover 4 principal aspects of reporting inventories. We'll look at what information must be reported in an inventory and which information may be reported on an optional basis. We'll look at some emissions reporting tips for determining what types of information to report optionally in inventories. And we'll close with a discussion of using performance metrics for interpreting emissions data. And we'll go through each of these topics in turn. But first of all, let's consider some GHG protocol reporting basics. Fundamentally, a credible GHG report presents information that is relevant, complete, consistent, transparent, and accurate. Those are the 5 GHG protocol principles. And now, while it takes time to develop a rigorous and complete corporate inventory of emissions, knowledge does improve with experience in calculating and reporting data. So the GHG protocol recommends that a public inventory do a number of things in that regard. We recommend that it be based on the best available data at the time of publication, whilst also being transparent about its limitations. And also that the inventory communicate any material discrepancies identified in previous years, and include the company's gross emissions for its chosen inventory boundary. And those gross emissions must be separate from and independent of any GHG trades that the company might have engaged in. So, for example, the gross emissions would be reported separately from the purchases of any offsets. And the idea of this lesson then is that by following the requirements and guidance we'll be reviewing in this lesson, you should be able to produce inventories with the necessary detail and transparency for credible public reporting. So at a basic level, an emissions inventory contains 2 broad types of information. First, there is the required information that's considered the minimum necessary to ensure the reported data are transparent and serve as a reliable basis for informed decision making. And second, there's the optional information that companies can, if they want to, include in their inventories to enhance the relevance and the utility of those inventories in decision making. The required information covers a description of the company and the boundaries it set in developing its inventory, as well as emissions data for scopes 1 and 2. And in turn, the optional information includes a description of performance, the use of any emissions reduction offsets, and also Scope 3. So let's go through each of these items in more detail, starting with the required information. Just to forewarn you a little bit, I will be showing a relatively long list of both required and optional reporting elements, but it's important to know what these elements are, so please do bear with me as I move down through the list. So, in order for an inventory to be in conformance with the corporate standard, it has to include a number of descriptive elements on the company and boundary information. That just means companies should describe what business units are included in the inventory and whether they've used one of the control approaches or the equity share approach. Companies also have to provide an outline of the operational boundaries used, and if Scope 3 is included, they should provide a list that specifies which types of activities are covered. And as the exercises yesterday showed, a list of Scope 3 sources is important because Scope 3 is optional and there are a lot of Scope 3 categories. So providing this list can help users understand how comprehensive the Scope 3 reporting really is. And the last requirement here is that the inventory should obviously include the reporting period. Inventories, of course, have to contain quantitative data on the emissions themselves, and the corporate standard outlines a series of requirements to ensure the credibility of those data. First, the total Scope 1 and 2 emissions must be reported, and they must be reported, again, independently of any GHG trades that the company might have engaged in, such as, say, the sale, the purchase, or the banking of allowances or offsets. The emissions data must be reported separately for each scope. So Scope 1 separately from Scope 2, separately from any Scope 3 emissions. And emissions data must be provided for all 7 GHGs, namely carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, HFCs, PFCs, SF6, and NF3, okay? So emissions data must be provided separately for the 7 different types of greenhouse gases. And also, these data must be provided in units of metric tons and in tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. For example, if a company emitted 100 tons of methane, it would have to report that 100-ton figure alongside the corresponding CO2 equivalent value that was obtained after the use of the appropriate global warming potential value. As we discussed on day 1, the CO2 emissions from biomass must be reported separately from the scopes as a memo item. And again, that's because it's assumed that those emissions have no net impact on the climate. But remember, the methane and nitrous oxide emissions from biomass combustion are reported within the scopes, so they still have to be reported. Another requirement is to report the year chosen as the base year and an emissions profile over time. In lesson 5, we discussed tracking emissions over time and mentioned how base year inventory should be recalculated in certain circumstances, such as acquisitions or divestitures, outsourcing or insourcing, changes in reporting boundaries or calculation methods, etc. And because these recalculations can have quite a significant impact on the comparability of emissions data over time, the corporate standard requires that companies also report the appropriate context for any changes that have triggered recalculations to the base year inventory. So you just need to explain why recalculations were made. Another requirement is to report the methods used to calculate or measure the emissions, as well as a reference or a link to any of the calculation tools used. And I think actually that's quite an important component of an inventory, and it gives users a sense of the potential accuracy of the calculations. So to take an example, we could look at the emissions from agricultural sources or industrial process sources. And those can be calculated with quite different levels of accuracy using, say, the IPCC international default emission factors I mentioned, or more facility-specific or location-specific emission factors. And so reporting the tools and emission factors used does help give users a sense of the overall level of accuracy of the inventory. And finally, as mentioned before, companies are required to report any specific exclusions of sources, facilities, and or operations. Okay, so a lot of information must be contained in reports, and these aren't the only requirements. The new Scope 2 guidance also introduced some requirements around Scope 2, and particularly the use of the market-based approach. So again, these requirements really only relate to when the reporting company has operations in a market that offers product or supplier-specific data in the form of contractual instruments or some kind of differentiated electricity product. And in these cases, as you hopefully recall from our discussions, the Scope 2 guidance requires that companies use both the market-based and the location-based methods to calculate their Scope 2 emissions. So what that means in practice is that companies end up with 2 Scope 2 totals. And then companies have the choice of which Scope 2 total to use for the purposes of setting a reduction target and then tracking performance against that target over time. That's fine. Companies can use either Scope 2 method for doing so, but the requirement is that companies are transparent about what method was used to set a target and then track performance over time. A final requirement here is that when companies are using the market-based method, they ensure that whatever emission factors are used meet certain quality criteria in the Scope 2 guidance. And we haven't covered these quality criteria yet, but they are an important part of the Scope 2 guidance. And just to give you a flavor of what those criteria look like, I thought it'd be helpful to share the text from the Scope 2 guidance around the criteria. And further information on these criteria will be provided in the recorded webinar that will be sent afterwards, sent after this training. But just to provide a snapshot for the time being, Table 7.1 summarizes these criteria. And for example, an instrument such as a PPA or a renewable energy certificate or guarantee of origin can only be applied to the market-based total if it meets these criteria. If it, for example, conveys the GHG emissions rate associated with the unit of electricity produced, that's a fairly obvious point. It means that the certificate or instrument must carry the specific emissions profile associated with the unit of electricity that, upon which that certificate is based. Also, the instrument must be the only one carrying the emissions profile associated with the underlying unit of electricity generation, and that's an effort to avoid double counting. Also, in an effort to avoid double counting, these certificates must be tracked and redeemed, retired or cancelled by or on behalf of the reporting company. And To ensure that the use of the instrument is credible, we also require that the certificate or the instrument be issued and redeemed as close as possible to the period of energy consumption to which the instrument is applied. Okay, so if you're compiling an inventory for 2017 data, for example, you wouldn't want to use a rec that was, for example, issued 4 years ago or 3 years ago. Okay. And there are other criteria outlined in the Scope 2 guidance. Because the market-based method will be relevant to many of you, I would encourage you to consult Chapter 7 of the Scope 2 guidance to learn more about the criteria, and certainly to listen to the recorded webinar on the guidance. Okay. So let me turn to the presentation. And we've covered the required reporting elements. Let's look at optional reporting elements. And since we're on the topic of Scope 2, let's look at some of the optional reporting elements that the Scope 2 guidance recommends. These aren't requirements, but they're simply recommended options. And these recommendations include that companies report the annual electricity consumption in the relevant units, that they report the basis for any upstream Scope 3 calculations, okay, relating to any purchased energy. So a company would report the emissions from purchased energy in Scope 2, but there are upstream emissions associated with that energy from the production, processing, and transportation of the fuel. And those upstream emissions would be reported within Scope 3, and they'd be reported within a specific Scope 3 category, which has a number, which is number 3 in the list of 15 Scope 3 categories. And finally, companies may also want to report features of the contractual instruments that have been purchased and reflected in the Scope 2 total using the market-based approach. So there are a range of instrument features that are relevant here, where they could include aspects such as certification labels, power plant features such as technology type, and policy context characteristics, such as if the facility received a subsidy and its relationship with supplier quotas. So there are a range of information that companies may want to include on an optional basis in their inventories. If we step away from Scope 2 for a minute, as you can imagine, there are a wide variety of optional reporting elements that companies might decide to include in their inventories. I just want to highlight a few more on this slide. One element is information on any contractual provisions that address GHG-related risks and obligations. So, for example, as we discussed previously, a company may participate in a joint venture, but under the terms of that agreement, it may have to report all 100% of the emissions from that venture. So in that case, it would be useful to mention that contractual provision in the inventory. Another element is an outline of any external assurance that's been obtained for the inventory. And this might include a copy of a verification statement. So as we described then, or as we discussed, the corporate standard doesn't require that inventories be verified. Instead, we have a chapter that provides guidance on verification. Companies could also report information on emissions changes that have not triggered base year recalculations. So, for example, they could describe how organic growth has impacted their emissions over time. Optionally, they could include information on emissions for all years between the base year and the current reporting year, but again, the requirement is only to report the base year inventory alongside the inventory for the current reporting period. Information on inventory quality is, I think, another important element, and you can include here details on uncertainties and policies to improve the quality of the inventory process. And in terms of carbon sequestration, the GHG protocol doesn't provide methods for accounting for sequestration, and that's because at the time the corporate standard was developed, it was considered that there just wasn't enough consensus around what the reporting requirements should look like for carbon sequestration. So instead, the corporate standard simply states that companies can report information on carbon sequestration if they want to, but if that information is reported, it should be reported outside of the scopes in a memo item. Okay. And finally, companies might also want to include a list of facilities reported in the inventory. I skipped this slide, so let me talk about it now. And this slide shows a set of further optional elements that could be included in inventories. So one relates to Scope 3 data for activities for which reliable information can be obtained. Emissions have to be reported by scope, but they could be further subdivided by, say, business units or facilities, by country, or by source type, such as stationary combustion versus process emissions versus fugitive emissions, etc. And companies will also, or will have to decide which particular subdivision makes most sense given their own reporting objectives, and also any concerns regarding data sensitivity. Incidentally, if your company reports to the CDP, then you should be aware that the CDP does ask for emissions data to be disaggregated by country and source type. Another optional item is the emissions attributable to a company's own generation of electricity that is then sold or transferred to some other company. Now, those emissions should already be reported within Scope 1 by the company that produced the electricity, but sometimes companies in the sector do find it useful to report them as a memo item outside of the scopes when they generate a lot of electricity. We also discussed earlier how the emissions of the 7 gases targeted by the Coded Protocol and the UNFCCC should be reported within the scopes. Companies can optionally report the emissions of other gases, such as CFCs, as long as those gases are reported in a memo item. Okay? And most companies tend not to do that. They instead focus on the 7 required greenhouse gases. Continuing on down this list, companies could also describe their performance against various internal or external benchmarks, and as part of that performance assessment, they could also report relevant performance metrics or ratio performance indicators. And we'll talk a bit more about those later on in this lesson. So we'll come back to that point shortly. And finally, I think I've reserved a very important point to the end. Companies could also provide an outline of any GHG management or reduction programs or reduction strategies that they're undertaking. And I think that is actually quite an important element, as without inventories lack a lot of meaningful context. And that information doesn't have to be provided with the inventory itself, but it should be provided, say, in an accompanying CSR report or provided elsewhere. So the inventory can just include the other required elements I've described, but really I think a company should be describing its efforts to reduce emissions in a place that's accessible to external users. Okay, let's turn to the topic of offsets for a minute. And this topic does come up frequently in conversations with companies. I mentioned earlier that companies have to report their gross emissions separately from any offset transactions. And if any offset transactions have taken place, then companies are encouraged to provide information on those transactions. So, for example, if offsets have been purchased or developed outside of the inventory boundaries, then companies should report two general types of offset projects separately. One type is all projects that involve carbon sequestration, and the other is projects that reduce emissions. And ideally, companies would separately disclose projects involving carbon sequestration because there are issues regarding the permanence of that sequestered carbon, which could be re-emitted into the atmosphere in the future. So that's why we recommend that these two broad types of projects be reported separately. Companies should also specify if those reductions have been verified or approved by some external program, such as the gold standard or CDM. Finally, if companies have sold reductions that took place within their boundaries, they should specify if those reductions have been verified or approved by an external program again. And one additional point here is that it's important that any reductions that have taken place within the inventory boundaries and that have been sold, it's important that those are not double counted within the inventory. And what that means in practice is that the reductions will have to be excluded from the inventory. In effect, that means adding on those reductions to the inventory. Okay, so let's pause for a breath here. I think we've covered a lot of information that companies could optionally report in inventories, but how can companies know which optional information they should report? So let's change gears for a bit and think about this issue. Broadly, the appropriate amounts of optional information can be determined based on the objectives and the intended audience for the report. So, for example, looking at Scope 3 emissions, there are various considerations in selecting which, if any, Scope 3 categories are relevant to report. And the corporate standard does provide guidance on that issue in Chapter 4. So, for example, some types of Scope 3 categories might be relevant to a company if they're large or believed to be large relative to the company's Scope 1 and 2 emissions, or if they somehow contribute to the company's risk exposure, GHG risk exposure, or if they're deemed critical by key stakeholder groups, or if they offer opportunities for reductions that could be undertaken or influenced by the reporting company. Okay, so the various considerations go into selecting a Scope 3 standard. Further guidance on that topic is available in Chapter 4, the corporate standard, and of course in the Scope 3 standard itself. Companies, when thinking through what what to report, companies should be mindful that for national or voluntary programs, reporting requirements may differ from those of the corporate standard. We touched on that point previously. So, for example, a voluntary GHG program might require a verification statement or a list of all the facilities that were included in the inventory. They might also require a specific organizational boundary approach or specify a specific significance threshold. So to recap that, virtually every facility, let me rephrase that, virtually every corporate level reporting program is based on the corporate standard, but on occasion those programs may add on additional requirements to those contained in the corporate standard. Turning to the third point on this slide, for public reporting, it's important to differentiate between a summary of a public report, that's for example published on the internet or in a CSR report, and a full public report that contains all of the information required by the corporate standard. So not every circulated report must contain all of the information required by the corporate standard, but some link or reference should be made to a publicly available full report where all information is available. And at the end of this lesson, what I'll do is I'll share a template that provides one example of how such a full report can be structured, and that adheres to all of the reporting requirements in the corporate standard. And finally, for some companies, providing emissions data for specific gases or business units or reporting specific benchmarks, those things may compromise business confidentiality. And if that's the case, then these data need not be reported publicly, of course, but they can be made available to those auditing GHG emissions data. Okay, so let's move on to the last section of this lesson, which is about ratio indicators in interpreting emissions performance. Again, the reporting of these ratio indicators or performance metrics is optional, but they are extremely useful. And companies may choose to report these metrics to accomplish a number of different goals, including to evaluate performance over time. For example, metrics can be used to relate figures from different years, to identify trends in data, and show performance in relation to targets. And ratio indicators and performance metrics can be used to improve comparability between differently sized businesses and operations by normalizing the performance data. One important point here is that it is important to use metrics that make sense given your company's context. And I think it's important to recognize that the inherent diversity of businesses and the different circumstances of different companies means that indicators have to be used with some care. And that's because apparently minor differences in processes and products or locations can be quite significant in terms of the environmental effects. So as a result, companies really do have to know and understand the business context in order to be able to design and recommend performance metrics correctly. And it's for this reason then that the GHG protocol also recommends that companies provide some context on the indicators in public reports. That's just to help users reliably interpret what those indicators are intended to convey. To take an example, let's think of an agricultural company. That company might report emissions per amount of corn harvested, say. But weather events can impact the harvest and therefore the indicator. So it'd be important to provide that kind of contextual information to make that indicator more meaningful. Different types of indicators exist, and in designing these metrics, companies should consider what ratio indicators best capture the benefits and impacts of their business. I'll show some examples of different metrics on this slide, and let's go through these in turn. The first indicator is a productivity or an efficiency metric that just expresses the value or the achievement of a company divided by its GHG impact. So increasing efficiency ratios here will therefore reflect a positive performance improvement. Examples of these kinds of metrics include things like resource productivity, such as, say, sales per ton GHG, and process efficiency, such as production volume per ton GHG. The second type of indicator here is an intensity ratio, and that expresses GHG impact per unit of physical activity, such as emissions per electricity produced, or they express emissions per unit of economic output. So, for example, emissions per unit sales or per unit value added. One thing to note here is that a physical intensity metric is suitable when aggregating or comparing across business units that have similar products. And in turn, an economic intensity metric, where sales is in the denominator, is suitable when aggregating or comparing across businesses that produce different products. Okay, so you'll want to use a physical indicator for homogeneous sectors and some sort of financial indicator for heterogeneous sectors. And in either case, then a declining metric will reflect a positive performance improvement. And finally, almost trivially here, the third type of ratio indicator is simply a percentage comparison between emissions in different time periods. An obvious example here is expressing the current year's emissions as a percentage of base year emissions. Okay. So to recap that discussion on metrics, the basic point is that many different types of indicators exist, and companies have to be quite careful in selecting an approach and in disclosing any contextual information in their reports. Okay, so essentially we've concluded the presentation on reporting requirements. The key points are to follow the 5 GHG protocol principles when reporting. Scope 1 and 2 emissions must be reported, and companies can optionally report a wide range of information, including information on Scope 3, performance metrics, and offsets. But I think most importantly, companies should consider including information on their reduction strategies and on the general uncertainty of the emissions data. If the company is participating in a GHG reporting program, in addition to disclosing its emissions data voluntarily through its own website, then it's important, obviously, to check the reporting requirements of that program. And finally, metrics can be useful to help users interpret emissions performance. For further information on any of these topics, you should consult, first of all, Chapter 9 in the Corporate Standard. which outlines the requirements in more detail and provides additional guidance on reporting inventories, and also the Scope 2 guidance for aspects relating to the market-based approach. I see there are a number of questions. Let me take those in a couple of minutes. Before I break for questions, I just want to draw your attention to a Word document. And this is a sample GHG protocol reporting template. It's the template I mentioned earlier in this presentation. There are many different ways of structuring an inventory that would be compatible with the corporate standard. We don't require a specific reporting format over and above our requirements for what should be included in an inventory. Okay, so again, this isn't the official reporting template of the GHG protocol. Rather, it's a sample template meant to outline the reporting requirements of the corporate standard and the Scope 2 guidance. It's essentially intended to give you an idea of how you might prepare a full inventory for public disclosure. I won't go through this in detail. I'll let you peruse it in your own time. I'll just note a couple of things though. We think it's quite useful to indicate upfront in an inventory on the first page whether it's been verified by an accredited third party. That information can help users interpret the reliability of the report. The next section in the report outlines the various types of required information, including whether any operations or emissions sources have been excluded from the inventory. There is a section to provide information on operational boundaries and which Scope 3 activities are included. There's obviously a section to report the quantitative emissions data themselves alongside the base year inventory, which will go here. And then there's space to provide information on the underlying methodologies and the market-based approach. Okay, so that's the required information. There's also a section on additional optional information. And that information could include emissions data that are disaggregated by source type or facility or country, and information on offsets and the optional information on electricity products that a company is applying towards its market-based total. Okay. So this template does cover all of the required and optional elements we introduced in this section. Again, it's just intended to be illustrative to help you think through how you might go about structuring a public report that's in full conformance with the corporate standard. Okay, so that's the presentation. I see the number of questions. Let me tackle those. Katharina asks the following question. A company operates in different countries, and for some countries, market-based factors are available, but in other countries, those market-based emission factors are not available. And to answer that question, Katharina, I would refer the entire group to the emission factor accuracy hierarchy I showed yesterday in lesson 6. Okay, so if you recall, companies would preferentially use an emission factor that is specific to the PPA or the REC chosen if that information isn't available, if that emission factor isn't available, or if that instrument doesn't meet the Scope 2 quality criteria, then a company would instead use a grid average emission factor or a residual mix emission factor. So to answer your question, in those countries where the market-based factors aren't available, the company would use preferentially a residual mix factor, and if that's not available, then they would use a grid average emission factor. On the topic of offsets, or how to answer your question, CDM stands for the Clean Development Mechanism and was a mechanism established by the UN essentially to develop project reductions that countries could apply to their own inventories. And Alina, you ask whether there are any initiatives to commercialize project reductions in Brazil to markets outside of Brazil. The answer is yes, and the gold standard does have an initiative in Brazil, so you might want to follow up with them about that issue. Jenna asks an important question. So far, we've really only touched on calculating the emissions of carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide, but there are other required gases under the corporate standard. We will be looking at the emissions of refrigerants in the inventory exercise later on today, and we will not be talking about the emissions of NF3 and SF6 because those are released by industrial sources. So they're kind of beyond the scope of our exercise and our program. Instead, our focus is on those greenhouse gases that are commonly emitted by companies across sectors. And Antonio, an example of a process source would be something like cement calcination or aluminum smelting. A process source is an industry-specific industry source that isn't stationary combustion, mobile combustion, or a fugitive emissions source. Jim asks a great question, and that's essentially, is it preferred to set emissions reduction targets that are intensity targets, or is it preferred to set absolute reduction targets that involve reducing emissions relative to the gross emissions that a company reported in their base year? So are emissions intensity targets preferred, or are absolute emissions reduction targets preferred? From a climate perspective, I think it's important that companies set targets that are aligned with a 2-degree emissions pathway. But there are different ways to set those targets. Certainly, many companies set absolute reduction targets, but there are methods available through the SBT initiative that allow companies to set intensity targets that are still aligned with a 2-degree pathway. So if a company does wish to set an intensity target, we would recommend that it do so using one of the methods from the Science Based Target Initiative. Nicholas asks, what if non-CO2 GHGs are insignificant? Do we have to report them anyway? That's a good question. If you recall, one of the principles of the corporate standard is completeness, and we'd recommend that companies report all Scope 1 and 2 emissions in their inventory. And to determine whether an emissions source is de minimis, companies would have to do a back-of-the-envelope calculation anyway. And if they've already done that kind of back-of-the-envelope calculation, they might as well include those estimates in the inventory for sources that are expected to be small. Okay. So let's move on to the next lesson, which is essentially a review of all the material we have covered to date. And this lesson will be a concise review of topics we encountered over the past 3 days, and is an opportunity to ask any final questions about this material. I'll have 1 to 2 slides on each of the lessons, so this review really is intended to help you remember the main points, which will be useful before we head into the final exercise. A quick recap on the corporate standard. The corporate standard was originally published in 2001. A revised edition followed in 2004. It's a fully global standard available in 7 different languages, and it forms the basis for virtually every corporate level GHG reporting program around the world, and is used by at least 86% of the global 500 companies. So the point being, it is a fully global standard. The standard was developed to support several business objectives, and it was developed to simplify and lower the costs of developing an inventory, to harmonize GHG reporting and accounting practices around a core set of best practices, obviously to support public reporting of emissions data to external users, and to support reporting to internal management as well. In terms of the principles, as we discussed, all of the GHG protocol publications are designed with 5 overarching principles in mind. These principles are also intended to help users apply our publications and really ensure that GHG inventories represent a faithful, true, and fair account of a company's emissions. These principles are derived largely from financial accounting and reporting principles, and we saw an example of that when we were looking at recalculating base year inventories and in how companies draw organizational boundaries. I'm just going to spend a few moments on each principle because they are fundamentally important. In terms of relevance, inventories must contain information that both internal and external users need for decision making. And what this means in practice is that inventory should be designed to reflect company characteristics, stakeholder needs, and organizational structure. In terms of completeness, companies should really make a good faith effort to provide a complete accounting of their emissions. And they should account for all emissions within the chosen inventory boundary, and if some emissions have been estimated insufficiently, then those instances should be documented and justified in the inventory. Consistency is important, and it's important because comparable data are needed to track emissions performance over time. And in order for inventory practices to be consistent, then companies have to apply the same boundaries and calculation methods over time to document and justify any changes to those. The fourth principle is transparency. Here, emissions data must be disclosed in a clear and factual manner to allow users to have some confidence when interpreting the data. And finally, accuracy. Accuracy means that data should be credible enough to be useful in decision making, and that uncertainty should be reduced as much as possible. So again, these principles underpin the design of inventories, and of course there are going to be tensions amongst these principles at times, especially between completeness and accuracy. So part of the challenge in developing an inventory is attaining an optimal balance amongst them. On to organizational boundaries. There are three main accounting steps in designing an inventory: setting organizational boundaries, setting operational boundaries, and setting base years. What I'll do is spend a few slides on these steps to recap some of the most important steps or the most important points in implementing these steps. Organizational boundaries, of course, determine which operations are owned or controlled by the reporting company and which should therefore be included in the inventory. Organizational boundaries are important because oftentimes companies have complex structures which comprise subsidiaries, joint ventures, franchises, etc. So organizational boundaries provide a means for establishing a consistent method for accounting for all of the units that together comprise the reporting company. And even if a company has a relatively simple reporting structure or a relatively simple organizational structure, it should nonetheless use organizational boundaries. It should nonetheless set its organizational boundaries before developing an inventory. As we saw, the total amount of emissions accounted for by a company can vary significantly depending on the boundary approach chosen. As we saw, there are various considerations that companies would follow in thinking through which approach is best for them. Operational control is most commonly used, and it's also used as the basis for facility level reporting, but other approaches are used, and certain sectors might prefer other approaches. And I think I gave the example of the oil and gas sector, where equity share tends to be more common than it otherwise would be. So this slide recaps the various criteria for setting organizational boundaries. We have the equity share approach, under which organizations account for emissions according to the equity share they hold in the operation concern. And there are two approaches based on control. If you remember, under either control approach, an organization accounts for 100% of the emissions from operations over which it has control. And control can be defined in one of two ways: financial control and operational control. There is this binary accounting rule where companies account for all or zero of the emissions, and the only exception to that binary accounting rule is when financial control is used with joint ventures and joint partnerships. And in those cases, the accounting defaults to the equity share approach. The second crucial step in designing an inventory is setting operational boundaries, which classify emission sources by whether or not they are controlled and or owned by the reporting company or by a third party, and therefore whether they should be included in an inventory. As we've seen, setting operational boundaries is useful because they help reduce the risk of double counting emissions. They provide more useful information to stakeholders, and they help allow for the more effective management of various GHG risks and opportunities that exist along the value chain. This slide summarizes the concept of scopes, and here we see that Scope 3 sources can exist upstream or downstream of the reporting company. There are 15 distinct categories of Scope 3 sources, and companies may want to focus on reporting those categories that are most relevant to their business and goals and for which they have reliable information. And again, because Scope 3 emissions are optional, Scope 3 doesn't lend itself well to comparisons across companies. As this figure shows, only the emissions of these 7 gases should be reported in inventories under the scopes, and the emissions belonging to each scope should be reported separately. Any other emissions other than these 7 should be reported within a memo item, and this includes the emissions of CO2 from biomass and also the sequestration of carbon in soils and biomass. I think this graphic is useful because here we see the important role of operational boundaries in preventing double counting. Assuming companies use the same organizational boundary approach, then the same unit of emission should not be counted under the same scope by different companies. But if companies use different approaches, then double counting may occur. The same unit of emissions may be counted for under the same scope by more than one company. And Scope 3 inevitably entails some double counting. What Scope 3 for one company will inevitably be Scope 3 for another company. That's just inherent in Scope 3 accounting. In terms of more specific requirements on Scope 2, there are new requirements in Scope 2 guidance, including this dual reporting requirement. Also, market-based method instruments need to meet the Scope 2 quality criteria. And then there are also a range of recommended additional disclosures to give background and to help distinguish your power purchases. Again, the recording of the Scope 2 guidance webinar will provide more information on those. The third crucial step in designing an inventory is setting a base year. And a base year is the year in history against which a company's emissions are tracked over the time. Normally, it's the first year for which verifiable data are available, although if a company has been reporting emissions data for some time, then it makes sense to use a more recent year as the base year. Base years are important because they help companies track progress towards reduction targets, and they help companies put structural changes into context. Of course, related to that, an important aspect of base year emissions inventories is that they should be recalculated to ensure consistent inventory data and boundaries over time. So various factors trigger recalculations to the base year inventory, and these include structural changes in an organization, changes in calculation methodology, and the discovery of errors. And it's important to look at these factors collectively. Individually, some of these factors might be quite small, but collectively, they may be important and sufficient to trigger recalculation. On the other hand, base year inventories don't have to be recalculated when a company experiences organic growth or decline, or when changes involve facilities that didn't simply exist in the base year. And recalculation isn't needed for outsourcing or insourcing of activities that were previously reported under a different scope, okay? So that information is still contained within the inventory. Once those basic elements of inventory design are in place, then a company can proceed to calculate its emissions. This process involves 5 key steps. And the first then is to identify emission sources, which is really essentially involves determining whether they're a stationary, mobile, process, or fugitive emission source, and then to identify an appropriate calculation approach. And of course, we just covered reporting emissions. Okay, and given that we just covered that material, I won't provide a synopsis of it here. So that's the material we've covered over the past 3 days. We are about to jump into the final inventory exercise. Before I do that, let me see if any new questions have come in. Yes, Valeria, metrics can measure the emissions intensity of used energy. So you can use an emissions metric like emissions per unit energy. And using that kind of metric is relatively common. One question asks, where would we recommend getting emission factors such as average energy use per square foot of office or retail space? There are certain databases that provide those default emission factors, and I'm going to send around a link to the group a link to one such resource for the United States, and also a more general link to a global database. Okay, there are a couple of other questions. I'm going to type answers to those whilst you are doing the inventory exercise. With interest of time, let's plow on and start that exercise. I'll give you a minute to load it. It looks like this. Okay. So this is an exercise to, let me just make sure I'm sharing my screen. This is an exercise to develop an inventory for a hypothetical company. The objective of this exercise is to allow you to become more experienced in the application of GH protocol tools, and more fundamentally, to allow you to apply some of the concepts you've learned over the course of the last 3 days. Unlike prior exercises, we will be using Excel tools for these calculations, so there will be no need to set up your own formulae or to use a handheld calculator to get the results. So it should be more straightforward from that perspective. What I'll do now is just walk you through this document and the exercise itself, and see if you have any initial questions before you then delve into carrying out the tasks required in this exercise. So let's just consider the overall task, which is described in the first 2 paragraphs here. You've been contracted by a company, Ice Cold Beverages, to complete its first emissions inventory. Information about the company's structure and data about its activities are provided in this document, and we are to use the template provided on the last page of the exercise to complete the inventory. And I'll show you that template in just a minute. Let me bring up the right document. Here we are. Something to note is that ICE-Coles management has asked you to use the operational control consolidation approach to determine organizational boundaries. And also, because we only have a limited amount of time, I'm asking you only to account for scope 1 and 2 emissions. So we've been asked to develop a scope 1 and 2 inventory for a company for ice-cold beverages. If we turn to the next page, we see that the company comprises a total of 6 facilities or collection of sources. And these include the central office, production plant A, factory B, 2 vehicle fleets, and the distribution center. Okay. So do make sure you read this information before you carry out any of the calculations. So we have various components of the value chain represented here. The next 3 pages of this document spell out the emitting activities that the company undertook over the reporting period, and also provide the activity data that will allow you to calculate the emissions. Let me walk through these facilities right now. For central office, we see activity data pertaining to electricity consumption, to refrigeration use, and to mobile combustion. For production plant A, we see information relating to electricity use and stationary combustion. For factory B, we have information on electricity use again, stationary combustion, and refrigerant use. For the distribution center, we have information on electricity use, and then for the 2 vehicle fleets, we have information on distance traveled. So for each facility or vehicle fleet, there are up to 3 different emission sources that need to be included in the inventory. These are all cross-sector emission sources. And again, the focus here is on scope 1 or 2 sources, given the limited time available for the exercise. So please do keep that in mind. Make sure you read that second page on the handout, which describes the various facilities. The ultimate goal is to complete the template on the last slide. So this is the template. The template on the last page, rather. And the most time-consuming part of the exercise will be to calculate the emissions. What I'll let you do is read the first 2 pages on your own time. But again, note 2 things. Organizational boundaries will be drawn using operational control. And do make sure that you download the Excel tools first and save them onto your computer before trying to calculate the emissions. The approach we'll take in this section will be to tackle each facility or each fleet sequentially. We'll review the activity data available for each facility, and then I'll let you quantify the emissions using the appropriate tools. And then I'll come back with the answers. Once you have calculated the emissions for one given facilities, please make sure you raise your hand, okay? And then once a sufficient number of people have done so, I'll know that it's okay to come back to the group, quickly review my answers, answer questions, and then move on to the next section, okay? Let me know if you have any questions about that overall process. And if not, then let's look at the calculations for the first facility, which is the central office. Okay, so this central office is located in New York City. We are provided with electricity consumption. Of course, New York City is in a region where differentiated electricity products are made available, and so the company will have to report two Scope 2 totals, location-based total and a market-based total. And the company has actually purchased RECs to match 100% of its consumption at the central office. Okay. So we have electricity consumption data. Those would be needed to, you need to input those directly into the calculation tool to calculate the location-based total, and you wouldn't need the tool to calculate the market-based total in this case. The central office also has emissions from central air conditioning. To calculate those emissions, please use spreadsheet WS1B sales approach for users, okay, and make sure to use that spreadsheet in the refrigeration and air conditioning tool. Also, I forgot to mention that when calculating the emissions, the calculator uses eGrid emission factors to calculate location-based Scope 2 emissions. And the emission factor is matched to particular regions. In this case, ice cold is based in New York City, so you'd have to use the matching emission factor, which is for the NPCC New York City Westchester region. So please do ensure that you select that region when calculating Scope 2 emissions for the location-based approach. Okay. And then the third source is mobile combustion, and we're provided with some distance travel data there. So you'll need to use three tools to calculate these emissions: mobile combustion, refrigeration and air conditioning, and electricity consumption. I'll let you go ahead and do that on your own. If you have any questions, feel free to send questions. Obviously, please send me questions. And please remember that once you have completed the calculations, just raise your hand, then I'll know when it's appropriate to come back to the group with answers. Okay, so thank you all. We'll be back in touch soon. A number of you have questions regarding which calculation tools you should use. So those calculation tools are available from the Day 3 folder in the Google Drive folder. There are a total of 4 calculation tools we'll be using today, and calculating the emissions from central office will require you to use the purchased electricity tool, the RAC tool, which is the refrigeration and air conditioning tool, and the transport tool. And later on, for other facilities, we'll be using the stationary combustion tool. Okay, just a friendly reminder to raise your hand once you've completed the calculations for central office. Thank you, everyone. Okay. So in the interests of time, let's review the answers for central office. Let's take scope 2 calculations first of all. So remember, the company has to report 2 scope 2 totals under market-based and location-based methods. Let's do the market-based total first of all. We're told that the company purchased sufficient RECs to match 100% of their grid electricity consumption, and those RECs happen to meet the Scope 2 quality criteria. This effectively means then that Scope 2 emissions are 0 for the central office under the market-based approach, because we assume that the emissions profile carried by these RECs is 0. So we didn't need a calculation tool to come up with an answer there. We did need a tool to calculate emissions under the location-based approach. One thing to note is that the office only occupies a quarter of the second floor, and the central office's usage of the electricity is not separately metered. We only have information on total electricity consumption from that floor. And so we need to divide total grid consumption by 4 to come up with a proxy then for the amount of electricity consumed by the central office. Okay, so that's why we would have input 25% in the proper column in the tool. It's also important to use the corresponding grid average emission factor. In this case, it's specific to the NPCC New York City Westchester region. And again, after we've inputted the amount of consumption in the appropriate units, you should have come up with a total of 1.37 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay. So that's the answer for the location-based method. If we turn to air conditioning, the air conditioning equipment had fugitive emissions of a refrigerant called R410A. And refrigerants in general, including this refrigerant, have high GWP values, and we'll see the impact of that in a second. We needed to use a specific spreadsheet in the tool to calculate the emissions. And this is a relatively simple calculation. You only needed to track the amount of inventory at the beginning of the year and the end of the year. The decrease in refrigerant inventory is assumed to have been emitted. That's 20 kilograms. And once we multiply by the GWP factor, we find that refrigerant emissions caused 34.5 tons of emissions carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, that's a result of the high GWP value. And let's look at mobile combustion. Here we have information on distance traveled. Okay. To use that information, we need to identify the type of vehicle. Okay. So this is a passenger car that consumed gasoline and from model year 2005 to present. And after inputting the activity data, hopefully you find that the Scope 1 emissions from mobile combustion for a central office amounted to 177.33 tons. Okay, so if you didn't get the results, don't worry. We will be sending completed versions of the calculation tools as well as its answer worksheet at the end of the training today. So what I'd like you to do now is to tackle two facilities in tandem, production plant A and factory B, paying attention to the fact that they were only accounting for scope 1 and 2 sources, and then paying, which means you have to pay attention to the organizational boundaries and see which facility really needs to be accounted for under this scope 1 and 2 inventory. Jesse, yes, Jesse has asked, why do both methods need to be used if 100% of grid electricity consumption is covered by RECs? So if you recall, in our discussion on operational boundaries, we said that the pros and cons of the different approaches of a location-based and market-based method. They both reveal different types of information. Okay, and for that reason, it's important to report both whenever a company has access to these kinds of differentiated products. So even though it may have matched 100% of its grid electricity consumption with RECs, that's important information that's included within the market-based total, it's still important to report a location-based result. And it is, to answer another question, it is mandatory to report both the market-based and location-based approach totals whenever a company has operations in a market that offers these kinds of differentiated products, including RECs. And for most companies, that means they will have to report both a market-based and location-based method, because most companies operate in a region where these kinds of products are available. And folks, I neglected to mention that when using the stationary combustion tool for these facilities, you should select an appropriate sector in the stationary combustion tool. The right sector to choose here is manufacturing. Okay, let's review the answers. First, I'll take a look at production plant A. So the company needs to calculate emissions under the market-based and the location-based total. We've established that because the company purchased RECs for its facility in New York City, okay? Meaning it has to provide Scope 2 totals globally under the two approaches. Let's look at how the company calculates the market-based total for Plant A in Mexico. And here we're told that the company gets all of its electricity from a local electric utility, which discloses a supplier-specific factor. That factor, importantly, happens to meet the Scope 2 quality criteria. Okay. So to calculate the market-based emissions, then it's a simple matter of summing the monthly electricity consumption data and then multiplying aggregate consumption by the utility-specific emission factor. And once we do that, we know that the facility emitted 75.96 tons carbon dioxide over the reporting period, okay? And that's the figure that would be reported under the market-based total. So again, we didn't need to use the calculation tool to come up with that quantity. We did need to use the tool to calculate emissions under the location-based method, because here we need to multiply that aggregate consumption by the grid average emission factor, which is embedded in the tool. And once we did that, then hopefully you find that the answer under the location-based approach is 137.15 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay. Now we're also presented with information on stationary combustion. Natural gas and diesel oil was combusted. The company operates in the manufacturing sector. And once we put in the appropriate activity data, we find that total stationary combustion emissions for plant A amounted to 22.03 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay. So hopefully you follow those calculations. If not, please feel free to send in questions. Let's look at factory B. And hopefully you picked up on the fact that Big Beverages controls all of factory B's operations. So the factory is not under the operational control of ice cold. It does not fall under scope 1 and 2. Instead, it falls under scope 3. Ideally, the reporting company Ice Cold Beverages would report the emissions under scope 3, but for the purposes of this exercise and for the purposes of reporting under the corporate standard, that's not necessary. Okay. We don't have many more calculations left, actually. We just have calculations for the 2 vehicle fleets and for the distribution center. For the vehicle fleets, we have information on distance traveled, and for the distribution center, we have information on electricity consumption, and for which, again, we'd need to calculate a market-based and location-based scope 2 total. So why don't you go ahead then and take a stab at calculating the emissions from these 3 remaining facilities. And while you do that, do think again about the organizational boundaries and how they are applied to these facilities. In other words, which emissions would be reported outside of scope 1 and 2. And Cecilia, yes, I'm showing on the screen the results for stationary combustion from plant A. $22.03 tons. And And if you want to see the calculations in the Excel sheet, here they are. These are the calculations specifically for the plant A. So the emissions are calculated separately for each of natural gas and diesel, and then summed at the bottom here. We will be sharing at the end of this course the completed calculation tools, so you can have those for reference. And to answer another question, Texas is in the ERCOT regional grid. Hopefully that information is provided in the handout, but it's the ERCOT, ERCOT regional grid. Yes, so here it is. That information is on the first line of the handout for distribution center. Okay, so I see a number of you have completed the calculations. I'll wait a few minutes to give others a chance to catch up. In the meantime, I think it would be useful for you to fill out the template at the back of the handout. So basically just aggregating the results so far and um, calculating totals for scope 1 and 2. Okay, I'll just wait a couple more minutes and then come back with the answers. Thank you, everyone. Okay, let's take a look at the answers for high school vehicle fleet this time. So calculating those emissions simply involved multiplying the total diesel use by the appropriate emission factor, which is embedded in the tool and tied to the specific vehicle type used. So after inputting the activity data, the answer should have been 9,842 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay. The mobile combustion tool is a little unwieldy in the sense that it doesn't fit into all of my screen, but nonetheless, these are the results I obtained for the vehicle fleet. Okay. So answer is 9,842.3 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Let's look at the distribution center. Again, we need to calculate two scope 2 totals for the market-based and the location-based approaches. We're told that the firm matches 50% of its grid electricity consumption. Okay, those RECs meet the scope 2 quality criteria, meaning they can be applied to the market-based total. Given that those RECs only match 50% of its consumption, we will have to calculate grid average emissions for the remaining 50% of consumption. That's because no residual mix factor is available for the US in this exercise. Okay. So if you recall, when a company matches less than 100% of its grid consumption with instruments that meet the quality criteria, then emissions from the remaining consumption have to be calculated using grid average emission factors, and those emissions are still included in the market-based approach. Okay. So the purposes of this exercise then, we calculate total consumption over the year, we divide it by 2, and input that result into the tool. Okay, so 21,705 kilowatt hours of consumption were not matched with RECs, and we multiply those. The tool multiplies that consumption with the grid average emission factor that's specific to the ERCOT region, and the answer is 11.6 tons carbon dioxide. Okay, so the total for the market-based method then is 11.67 tons of carbon dioxide equivalent. For the location-based method, all we really need to do really is multiply that result by 2, because we want to calculate the grid average emissions, assuming that, or we want to calculate grid average emissions for 100% of the grid consumption. So we input total annual consumption of 43,410 kilowatt hours in the tool. The tool multiplies that amount by the ERCOT specific emission factor, and the result is 23.35 tons carbon dioxide equivalent. Okay, so hopefully you followed that. If not, please send me questions, of course. And let's turn to Quickie's delivery fleet. Hopefully you recognize that Ice Cold Beverages does not have operational control over these vehicles, and so the fleet's emissions would only fall under Scope 3 for Ice Cold Beverages. And there's no need to calculate them for the purposes of this exercise. Okay, we're now in a position then to aggregate emissions from across the facilities and come up with totals for Scope 1, Scope 2 under the market-based method, and Scope 2 under the location-based method. I'll keep this table on the screen here for a minute or so for your reference. And total Scope 1 emissions summing across the company are 10,076 tons. Scope 2 emissions under the market-based approach are 87.63 tons. And under the location-based approach, Scope 2 emissions are 161.87 tons. So those are the final calculated results. And then the last step was merely a matter of filling out the inventory. Okay. So this is obviously a very much an abbreviated version of the full inventory template I showed earlier on. Here, though, we'd indicate the consolidation approach used, operational control, the various facilities covered and included within the inventory boundary, the reporting period, and which scopes are included in the inventory. And of course, Scope 1 and 2 emissions are required. some information on the base year and emissions profile over time. This is the first year the company is calculating its emissions, and so calendar year 2009 would be its base year. And again, we have the calculated results for the various scopes. And Valeria states that she's never seen a disclosure of scope 1 and 2 emissions reported by both location and market-based approaches. So that's a good point. Under the corporate standard, companies have to report emissions under the scope separately. But for the purposes of setting a target, then you'll have to select a single scope 2 approach. And ideally, companies set targets that cover both scope 1 and 2 emissions. So they just come up with a scope 1 and 2 total that covers either market-based or the location-based method. And that's why we've come up with summed values in the template here. Okay. I'm just waiting for any further questions. There's one question around which of the two scope 2 approaches is mostly used to set targets. Good question. And from my experience, it is increasingly the market-based total. Historically, of course, companies used the location-based approach, but an increasing number of companies are now moving to the market-based total so that they can track the impacts of their specific procurements for renewable energy and PPAs and RECs and the like. Jesse, to answer your question, in the ERCOT example for Texas, I believe is the distribution center in Texas. And the question is around how do we calculate the market-based approach emissions. The important thing to know is that the company matched 50% of its total grid electricity consumption with RECs, and these RECs carry an emissions factor of 0. So already 50% of the consumption will have 0 emissions under the market-based approach. To calculate emissions for the remaining 50% of consumption, we need to use the grid average emission factor, which in the tool is specific to the ERCOT region. So you'd use the same grid average emission factor that you would use for the location-based approach, but you'd only be applying it to a subset of overall consumption for the market-based approach in this example. Okay. Okay. Well, I don't see any additional questions at this time. I'll wait a few seconds in case somebody's still typing one. we're somewhat ahead of schedule today, so there is time to ask any additional questions. Okay, and if you do think of a question after the training, please feel free to reach out to me directly, and I'll be more than happy to take questions for the next week or so. Okay. So given that there are no further questions, let me just first of all thank you very much for your attendance. Yelena is waiting to provide some information on certificates and the like. So I'll pass you over to her shortly. But first of all, I just wanted to say that I thoroughly enjoyed working with you over the past 3 days and appreciate the many questions you sent to me. I hope that you've learned a lot, and I hope that you also take advantage of the other trainings that are available from the GHG Protocol website. And certainly, please do watch the recorded webinar on the Scope 2 guidance. I think that will be very illuminating and helpful for you. Okay, and so with that, thank you everyone, goodbye, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and good luck in your GHG accounting endeavors, and let me pass you on to Yelena now.
Great, thank you very much, Stephen. Thanks everyone for making it through the training, and congratulations. I just want to make a couple quick announcements, just repeating some of the things that said on the first day and also reiterated by email. But I just want to let everybody know that, you know, if you've made it through all 3 days of the training or watched recordings, if you've had to miss the live version, you will receive a certificate of completion from GHG Protocol by the end of the day next Tuesday, April 2nd. And almost everyone has been able to access the Dropbox and Google Drive folders that I've shared already. A few people haven't been able to, but I will be uploading recordings of the Scope 2 training webinar that Stephen mentioned into both of those folders. And if you're not able to access those, I know who you are, and I will send you links to watch the recordings. And reminder also that as part of your registration for this training, you can receive 20% off the Scope 3 Value Chain Standard e-learning. So please, you know, take advantage of that offer. It's a great training. You can do it on your own time from your tablet or computer, and with those 2 additional trainings, you're going to be able to get a very good comprehensive understanding of greenhouse gas accounting. And yeah, if you have, and I will also be sending around, of course, today the recording to today's session, as well as the answers to today's practice questions in the practice sheet. So with that said, yeah, thanks everybody very much. And please, you know, let us know if you have any feedback. We're happy to hear from you and to answer your follow-up questions. So thank you, and have a great rest of your day.